Argo will be talking about himself in third person today. But which of us is limited and which of us is omniscient? I'm Argo.
And I'm Mel.
And this is Writing Without a License. So, Mel, what even is third person? Because I only see two of us.
Third person is a perspective, which is a way in which you can write a book. We've already talked about first person, and in comparison to that, third person tends to use like he ran, and she ran, or they ran, versus first person, which is I ran, or second person, which is you ran away very quickly.
Fair enough. But why should I use it? Surely first person's good enough for everything.
Well, you'd think that, but not everyone likes first person, do they? I mean, same goes for third person. I said in the first person episode that as a teenager, I didn't like reading books in third person. I vastly preferred first. So it can come down to a matter of personal opinion, I think.
Which is quite impressive considering I feel like third definitely like the default, specifically in like sci-fi and fantasy.
Yeah, I was reading around this recently, and it seems like the YA genre is more likely to be written in first person present specifically. Not always, but like that you can find more books in the YA genre, hence why perhaps as a teenager I thought, oh yeah, first person books are really good, because that was what I was into as a young adult. Big surprise.
So I mentioned them in the intro of limited and omniscient. What's the difference?
I honestly, I get confused regularly because they're such like floppy words. You know what I mean? Like limited? Am I being restricted? I think omniscient is the easier one to start with because omniscient is like all-knowing. That's what it means. So when you're writing omniscient third person, you're writing from the perspective of a narrator who knows everything. They know everything about the plot. They know more than the characters do. And they might bring that knowledge into their descriptions of things every now and then. So compared to that, a limited third person is when that extra knowledge isn't used. And generally that's because you're writing from a character's sort of perspective. You're still using he, she, and they did X, Y, Z, but you're sort of like describing it from within what they would know. I think Game of Thrones does it a lot.
Specifically, it's about the thoughts of a limited third person contains the thoughts of your viewpoint character. They're not going to know anyone else's thoughts in the room. They can guess and they can speculate and you can tell that bit of the story through their actions and expressions. But ultimately, you don't know what they think. Whereas omniscient is you can say everything in the room, and omniscient also can spread as far wide as what happened in the past and the future. Whereas a third person limited is by nature the person's thoughts in the moment. There are exceptions to that. If it's like we discussed in the first person one, you could have a person talking about themselves in third person. So you're still limited to that, but with a future outlook. But for the most part, and for the standard and for the default, it's who you are, who your character is, and everything they did in the past. Nothing else. And it's one of the biggest mistakes early writers make, and I know I did, is flicking between it. Like you would start off going third person limited because that's the default. Like I said, that's what a lot of things are, especially the majority of things that are third person. But every now and then, you'd throw in someone else's. You'd get the occasional line that would just quite pull the reader out the story, like, but how does he know the other person is hungry? Or whatever emotion, or whatever thought process. And that's a really easy mistake to make, and one that over a bit of time it's a lot easier to cut out once you know the distinguishing. I do know it's like theorized that part of that reason is because growing up in schools you tend to study older classics which are much more omniscient. Like that was much more the style. Like a big example being most of Charles Dickens' works. A lot of them are all in omniscient, whereas modern day stuff isn't. So I think it's that growing up and seeing both but not knowing the difference. And not knowing it's generally a lot better to stick to one and not both.
Is that saying that you prefer limited to omniscient?
I prefer limited to omniscient, but I don't mind which. You just got to stick to one.
Yeah.
I find. Because third person limited is very much that halfway house between third person omniscient and first person. You're still getting the external details. You're still seeing everyone from a character from an arm's length. But equally, you're closer to the character. You're still getting the character. You're still seeing them as an unreliable narrator if they are. You're still getting their emotions that they're going through. You're still getting their reactions to things that they don't know all the information of. Game of Thrones, which you mentioned before, I think is a great example of you're seeing all the pieces, but they don't know all the other pieces, moves. They don't have all the information. They can only act on what they've got.
So with limited viewpoints, it's you can have more than one limited third-person viewpoint, but with omniscient, there's sometimes the temptation to describe everyone in the room, I guess, and sometimes maybe there's not a need to. And I'm not really certain I know the answer to this, but how, as an author, if you're trying to write an omniscient third person, do you know when to stop the description, I guess?
I don't think there's an easy answer. I think that comes down to the sort of story you're telling. Often if you are going omniscient by choice, then it's for a narrative purpose. It's because you want the style of this to be that. And describing that could be the whole point of it. You get stuff like Gormenghast, which does very much kind of fall to the omniscient side of things, but spends forever describing stuff. That's the whole point of the book. Whereas then,
Yeah.
I feel like if you're going omniscient, you go into that style anyway.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned Gormenghast, actually, I've had a few more intelligent thoughts on it. Because Gormenghast is quite famous for, or infamous as it may be, for its obscene description, which just goes on, and sometimes it's not always relevant, but sometimes that's the point of it. Like, that is the point of Gormenghast. It is like long-winded. It is a thing of its own creation. It breathes itself.
It's definitely one of those books where you just, if you're not liking it within the first few chapters, you're not going to like it at all.
Definitely.
Like, you've got to gel with the style and you'll love it. But if you don't.
But it has made me think of perhaps our episode on world building, where omniscient, maybe like world building, doesn't mean that you have to tell everyone absolutely everything. Because like world building, you don't need to paint the whole world, you just need to tell us where the characters are acting. Like, it's not always relevant what the politics are elsewhere if they're not going to show up in your story. And maybe that's something to bear in mind when you're writing omniscient, like how you feel when you're given too much world building from a book. It's maybe a similar approach, I think.
It puts me in mind of another style of third person, the secret third child of third person cinematic, which I think is a term created by Orson Scott Card, I want to say. I'll have to check that one. But essentially, it is about that. It's about that description of the scene, especially in anything that's third person limited. Sometimes you want that establishing shot. And I think it's becoming more and more popular because of the majority of media we consume being visual, being TV, being films. And it's quite a interesting way to bridge the gap, where you do focus on things that the character wouldn't necessarily be seeing, or things the character wouldn't necessarily be thinking about. It's a way of describing it all, and then you go to the person. The best example I know of it is the Wheel of Time books. Pretty much every single one starts with this big sweeping shot of, this is what the world is, this is what's going on, this is what's happening, before you narrow down into the character that's supposed to be there. Which is used to great effect in Wheel of Time because over the course of the series, the world's getting more and more corrupted, so you get to see this change by change of seeing just where the world is up to, which, especially when you're binge reading them, is great. But yeah, whether you count that as its own type of third person narrative is up to you.
I think that, like, within omniscient, there's like a huge range, like, because you could be omniscient like God, you could like literally know everything, or you could be like close to third person limited, but you know, a bit extra, which seems to be cinematic, or you can be like more than that. I think it's more of a scale than sometimes people give it credit for.
Yeah, there's some things that definitely tip the balance, but there's a lot of things that kind of get halfway.
Yeah.
Another big example of this, and it is a question I put in the doc to ask you, and your precise note to it is, I don't know, mate, lol. Is about Jane Austen's favourite method of third person limited, which is free indirect speech. Which the best examples you'll probably find online. I recommend looking them up because it's easier. But essentially, it's the difference between, he thought, what am I going to have for tea? And that would be direct speech, I think. I only looked this up like half an hour ago. And then, damn it, I've lost it. I'm going to edit this out.
Writing is hard.
Whoa. I wrote a book. When Tess accidentally joins a secret cult, she hires the only one who will believe her, unproven detective Blake Eastwood. Together, they try and steal the cult's prize from a moving train and find themselves embroiled in a magic but deadly game of hot potato. If you like fantasy detectives, action and adventure, and a little bit of goofy humour, then I think you will like the Blake Eastwood cases. The first one, and the second even, is they're out on Amazon now. If you like what we say on the podcast and you wish to support us, and see both me and Mel, who edited the book, put our money where our mouths are, then check out the link below. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. So, the example being, with the seamless cut, direct speech would be considered when you put the thoughts in its own brackets, or specifically in italics to separate it out from the rest of the paragraph. What am I going to have for tea? He thought. Then normal indirect speech would be just to fold it into the paragraph. He thought about what he was going to have for tea. And then my favourite, which Jane Austen also loved, is just to state it in the thing. Where you just go through the paragraph of, he arrived home. What was he going to have for tea? And just folding in their thoughts into the narrative, which I much prefer. And it helps, once again, it's on that scale of things, it's much closer to the benefits of first person, where you can get that direct link to your character's thought process.
I'm gonna have to go over my my book and see which version I fell into for my third person book.
Oh, definitely. I think I used both in my first book. Which sometimes works and sometimes didn't. Some thoughts deserve the more like a statement you're saying to yourself, as opposed to just the thought process you're on. Yeah, how many people do open the fridge and go, what shall I have for tea?
Rather
than plenty,
looking...
but it's the point still stands. You know what I mean.
I tend to open the fridge and go, eggs, meat, and that's it. Maybe I shouldn't write with indirect speech. Yeah.
But this is one of the things I always advocate across the podcast, which I may have never said before, but I do mean it a lot, is knowing makes it better. Knowing the difference between direct, indirect, and free indirect speech helps you to make a decision of which you're going to use. Helps you to stay consistent and helps your writing to appear more professional, because you're sticking with one way of writing, or you're using the different ones for a purpose. Like, you could switch between two characters, one which uses free indirect and the other uses a much more direct sort of speech, if you're wanting to emphasize the difference between people. Don't know if that would work, don't know if it'd be effective, but it's something to try and something you can play around with. Which brings me on to my next point. Mel, how do I write third person good?
I don't know, other than practice genuinely. And some of the other stuff. Oh, yeah, if you read some third person stuff and think about whether it's limited or omniscient, and then steal those ideas and put them in your own book.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite quotes is, a good writer steals from a few sources. A great writer steals from everything. And that every book is a remix of the dictionary. You've seen that meme go around. And it's essentially true. Everything is stolen from some part of your life or some part of the thing you've read. Very few things are very creatively incepted from nothing. But some advice I would have for those of you out there writing third person is to make the decisions of, are you writing cinematic? Are you writing omniscient? Are you writing limited? Are you going to go for direct speech or free indirect speech? Going for that. And making those decisions. And then just trying to maintain consistency with it. As I say, it's a very easy way to kind of pull people out of the scene if you're body hopping between one character to the next to the next. Or if you keep flickering between direct speech and indirect speech.
I think for some new writers, all those questions could lead to a bit of indecision and fear over how they're going to start. So if that's like one of our viewers, you can just start writing and see how it feels. And after that, you can approach your own writing and look at it and think, what does this fall into? And what do people on the internet think are the benefits of this style? And then you can change it after that. But at some point, you should think about those questions. It doesn't have to be before you write, but it should be during, perhaps.
Oh, definitely. And that applies to most advice you'll hear about writing, especially when it comes to prose, is often writing something's better than writing nothing. So just blasting through your writing, get the story to paper, then do a pass of it where you're like, do you know what? I'm going to make sure everything's really consistent here as I'm writing. Like, oh, okay, I'm gonna change to free and direct speech. I'm just gonna go through and make sure that everything's cut out of that for that way. And having that focus in mind probably leads to it being more consistent.
Whilst I don't have much advice for how to write third person good, other than give it a go, think about what you want from your story, I do have some thoughts on how to avoid writing third person bad.
Oh.
Yeah.
How not write third person back?
Yeah, what a sentence.
Write proper like what readers.
Exactly.
So wasn't the skills you were sharing?
The skills I'm sharing is that one thing I've read on the internet that I agree with is when writing third person and swapping viewpoints, a common mistake that new writers make is that they will write in one viewpoint for a while and then they'll hit a plot point where they're not sure how to continue forward, and instead of resolving it they'll go, I can switch to a new character, lovely, and I'll tell their story. And it's an endless cycle because you never learn how to resolve plot points and you just keep making more and more perspectives, and that can stunt your growth as a writer, and it can also it can prevent your book from being a better book. That was a better way to say that, but
No, yeah, you make a valid point, especially since you've got such behemoths of the industry, especially writing fantasy, when you've got your George R.R. Martins and you've got your Robert Jordans, where they play around with so many viewpoints. It makes it seem much more like the default.
yeah.
Whereas actually, half the reason A Song of Ice and Fire is as popular as it is, I think, is because of the skill in which George Martin balances them all. It keeps you interested in the overall story while still going viewpoint to viewpoint to viewpoint to viewpoint. Especially starting out, I've heard it said your first book or two shouldn't be more than one viewpoint. I disagree. I think like 3 or 4. But it's still the aspect of having the purpose to the viewpoints. And focusing on only a few just, like I say, helps you resolve plot points, helps you grow as a writer.
Yeah, it's not to say that you can't do it. It's just that you should be wary when you're doing this.
Because it brings us back to, like, say, the original point that we mentioned of letting the viewpoints get away from you. Especially when you're looking at third limited. And to it even extends to a certain extent to the first person of just having too many viewpoints and slipping between them. Third limited is much more easy to slip between one, start the chapter from the viewpoint of one character and end it from a viewpoint of another. And to my knowledge, I only know of one book that did that well. Which I can't think of. I want to say Ender's Game?
I've not read it.
I don't fully
Maybe.
remember. I think it's like basically hands over at one point, but I'm not fully sure. But the point being is consistency. And be that in between viewpoints in one scene or be that viewpoints in a book. One final question. We talk about multiple viewpoints and the issues of slipping between them. But how should I change between viewpoints?
Generally, not within the same chapter, I think. I think there's a few like special chapters that you can get away with in a book where you like quickly change between which perspective you're telling it from, and those tend to be action chapters. You know, they're at the end of the book and there's like high emotion, and you have character A get stabbed and character B, you suddenly switch into them and they're going no. So sometimes it can be effective. There's exceptions to every rule. However, generally you want to stick with like one perspective per chapter. Sometimes you'll have the same character for a run of chapters, but then you need to be aware of that it's a common criticism of Game of Thrones that not really a criticism, but like, you know, a reading quirk that everyone experiences is that if you have a favorite character and you don't see them for ages, angry reader, annoyed, frustrated.
Which does fit in with the avoiding multiple point of views.
Yeah.
Which I think we covered in the first person.
Possibly.
I'll find out when I'm editing.
But when you're changing perspectives, I think you need to be aware of how you're balancing those perspectives for your readers, because your readers are going to have a favourite. You might love all your characters equally, but they won't.
One other thing I'd add to that is not switching between viewpoints in a scene. I think it can be done, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but I feel like it just makes the pacing so much slicker if you're using that switch of POV to push the story forward. You're seeing one person in here, and then you see the other person, even if the same characters are there. If it's a separate scene, it's just a really handy point to kind of push things forward.
And when you're changing the perspective, it needs to be very clear. Otherwise, readers get confused. Like, usually in books, I think they do it like there'll be like a space, a gap. There's probably a technical term for that. And you'll start like a new section. And generally, you want the first line to make it extra clear who this is. And that's the same for like beginnings of chapters. But yeah, especially...
It's why so many authors do put the name of the viewpoint in the chapter. In the chapter heading even.
Yeah.
But I tend to try and make sure the first name the reader reads is the viewpoint they're going to be in. Because once you've got it set in... Because once you've got the reader set in a mindset of, oh, I'm in this character, to kind of switch it out last minute is something that pulls the reader out.
Yeah. So it's something to do with a lot of care, like all aspects of writing. You know, you could throw it down for a first draft, but then after that, you've got to be careful. You've got to think about things like this. Like, is my reader aware of who's talking? And you might be, because you're the writer, you know what to expect, but they don't necessarily.
Wise words to end on. I feel like I should have a quick... I can't think of anything without promising second person, and we're not doing an episode on second person.
I think I could carry an episode on second person. I've thought about it so much because hipster. Tell me I can't do it. I wanna.